Perfect. Wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. My name is Zara Bain, and I'm going to be chairing this wonderful session. We're looking forward to a paper from Dr. Johnathan Flowers. And the topic of this panel is going to be COVID-19 and the disinheritance of an ableist world. So, Dr. Johnathan Flowers is a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Worcester State University in Worcester, Massachusetts, USA, and specializes in the American pragmatism of John Dewey, East Asian philosophy, and Africana philosophy as they intersect with and are applied to disability, race, gender, sexuality, technology, and popular culture. In addition to his scholarly work, you can find his writing in The Conversation, The Chronicle of Higher Education, and on Twitter at Shengokai. So I think Jonathan's going to share some slides with us and we'll take it from there. Jonathan, if everyone could kind of join me in thanking Jonathan. Thank you so much. We really look forward to your talk.
Thank you. So this talk will seek to resituate the presumed accessibility gains that have emerged in the wake of COVID-19, not as gains for disabled people, but as products of a world that is prepared for some persons and some bodies and not others. Thus, I believe a more productive approach to understanding the sudden possibility of impossible accommodations would be through Sarah Med's treatment of the inheritance of a world and how inheriting a world places some objects in reach while denying access to other objects. On this view, ableism as an organizing force in the world serves to determine what bodies can and cannot do by virtue of the ways that it prepares the world for some bodies and not others. Thus, as I will argue, the previous impossibility of the current widespread accommodations was due to the ways that academia and society broadly was a world designed to be inherited by some bodies and not others. So Sarah Med in A Phenomenology of Whiteness begins with orientations as a precursor to inheritance. For Ahmed, the history of colonialism serves not only to organize the perception of bodies in the world, but the world into which these bodies emerge. Drawing on Fanon, Ahmed presents the racialized body as a product of the historical project of colonialism to remake the world in the image of whiteness, a history that serves to orient bodies prior to their arrival. So as a result, the world that we inhabit becomes a world that is prepared for some bodies and not others. More crucially, not only does this world made white by colonialism place some objects in reach of some bodies and not others, it also structures how bodies take shape through the imposition of the history of colonialism. The history of colonialism therefore allows some bodies and not others to be at home through the ways that it supplies the conditions for how we inhabit the world. Thus, for Ahmed, race then does become a social as well as a bodily given, or what we receive from others as an inheritance of this history. Despite being an inheritance, Ahmed does not treat race, whiteness specifically, as a reachable object. Rather, Ahmed's point is that whiteness is a mode of orientation, a starting point from which the world unfolds. As such, the history of colonialism and whiteness as an orientation serves to determine which persons can reach for which objects in a world made white. Whiteness, like the world structured by colonialism, is an inheritance that can be taken up by some persons and not others, and as such, allows the white person to extend their body through space in ways that other people cannot. Put another way, to inherit whiteness is to inherit a world that is prepared for the arrival of the white person, a world that is familiar to white people and a world that is comfortable for white people. It is a world that does not resist the actions of white people through its very organization because of the ways that the white person fits into the world. Now, to fit into a world for Ahmed is to inherit a likeness to the world, a familiarity with the world in the sense that white people understand the world because it is like them. Familiarity on this view is an effect of the proximity of objects and bodies to one another. Ahmed uses the metaphor of peas in a pod in describing the ways that objects are shaped by the ways they share space. Put another way, insofar as whiteness is inherited as an orientation, it is inherited as an orientation towards, a proximity to other things that emerge as white through the effect of the history of colonialism. Thus, for Ahmed, we inherit proximities and hence orientations as our point of entry into a familial space as a part of a new generation. Such an inheritance in turn generates likeness. In the context of World Made White, inheriting the orientation of whiteness generates a likeness towards the world, which enables the white person to fit into a world that is prepared for their arrival. In keeping with the familial metaphor, the white person emerges not only into a world, but into the familial space of whiteness. So as with Ahmed, I begin with the concept of orientation and likeness as crucial for understanding how the world is disinherited through ableism. Again, likeness for Ahmed enables familiarity through the family resemblance between the person and the world they inherit. However, ability is also inherited. Ability is a way of being at home in a space, including institutional and academic spaces. Ability is also an orientation that we inherit. Like whiteness, ability is a starting point from which the world unfolds and serves to put some objects in reach through the ways it orients bodies in space. On this view, ability, like race, becomes a question of what is in reach, what is available to perception and for bodies to do things with. Insofar as ability structures how bodies do and do not fit in with the organization of the world and thus what they can reach, my use here of bodies here is specific. There are times, places, and spaces where disabled people simply do not fit into a space organized for us and where objects are placed out of reach, literally. And as noted above, a space that is not organized for us is a space that is not prepared for us. A space that is not prepared for us is a space that cannot be taken up or inherited by a disabled person. A world organized by ability is a world that disinherits disabled people. So as an orientation, the inheritance of disability is a way of inhabiting the world as familiar, as sharing a familial likeness or resemblance to the world. Rosemary Garland Thompson also offers a crucial insight into familial likeness and disinheritance. And I quote at length, the narrative of likeness is crucial, or the narrative of likeness crucial to group unity fractures critically with the arrival of disability to a family or circle. This does not mean that disabled people are unloved or unaccepted within families or communities, but it suggests another way that congenital or early onset disability can be understood as some version of wrongness, often a benevolent wrongness, because it violates the anticipated continuity of sameness as non-disabled status within families, end quote. So the anticipation of continuity of sameness for Garland Thompson functions in similar ways to the family line proposed by Ahmed. Briefly for Ahmed, the family line is the projected continuation of the nuclear family insofar as it presupposes a continuity with the structures that came before it. Structures predicated upon an assumption of heterosexuality and cissexuality as essential for carrying forwards the familial structure. In the above, the disabled child fractures the line projected by the assumption of ability, the assumption of normalcy. I charge that this initial wrongness makes clear the thoroughgoing structuring of the world by ableism insofar as it projects a line of wrongness that serves to structure the disabled person's ongoing interactions with the environment such that some objects are placed in reach and out of reach. Some places are made accessible and inaccessible through their organization around the anticipated continuity of sameness of bodies with space. The depth of the effects of this anticipated continuity of sameness is made clear in Mark Johnson's engagement with architecture in the aesthetics of bodily meaning and thought, the bodily roots of philosophy, science, morality, and art. This provides an excellent example of the ways that ableism structures a world that disinherits disability. For Johnson, what any object affords is the result of the nature of our bodies and brains. Our perceptual apparatus, our neural processes, our affective responses, our motor programs as they interactively engage patterns and structures of our environments. On this view, the ways that we engage with the environment through our bodies structures how objects provide or afford their uses. Moreover, the meaning of the object becomes clear through the ways that an object or space enables us to transact with it in specific ways. This has crucial implications for Johnson's view on architecture explained in the following. And I quote, "My hypothesis is that architectural structures are experienced by humans as both sense-giving and signifying. That is, architectural structures present us first with a way of situating ourselves in or being at home in and making sense of our world. And second, they provide physical and cultural affordances that are meaningful for our survival and flourishing as meaning-seeking creatures," end quote. That is, for Johnson, architectural structures are significant for the ways that they enable our flourishing as meaning-seeking creatures and for the ways that they allow us to be at home in our environment. Read back through Ahmed's thesis of inheritance, architecture affords the sense of being at home only insofar as the architectural structure is familiar to us or affords a sense of likeness to the organization of our bodies. Here, familiar once more encompasses the sense of nearness, of proximity to an object. It is this proximity that supplies us with the implicit knowledge of how to navigate a space. While this proximity is shaped socially and culturally, insofar as we are like the structure in question and can situate ourselves through our likeness to the structure or those who constructed it, we can become familiar with the structure itself. Ableism, on the other hand, disinherits the sense of the familiar. It disinherits the ability to fit in. This observation is not new. Garland Thompson, who Ahmed cites, refers to this as a misfit. For Garland Thompson, quote, "A misfit occurs when the environment does not sustain the shape and function of the body that enters it. The dynamism between body and world that produces fits or misfits comes at the spatial and temporal points of encounter between dynamic but relatively stable bodies and environment. The built and arranged space through which we navigate our lives tends to offer fits to majority bodies and creates misfits with minority forms of embodiment, such as people with disabilities," end quote. Garland Thompson offers a crucial demonstration of the problem of Johnson's hypothesis regarding architecture. Namely, insofar as the built environment takes the able body as its starting point, that environment will consistently fail to sustain disabled bodies that enter it by preventing their successful navigation of the space. Here we should understand the shape and function of the body in a space to also include the ways that body can reach for objects, or the ways that body is oriented towards or away from objects within the environment, which, as Johnson notes, provide cultural affordances that are meaningful for our flourishing as meaning-seeking creatures. That is, the anticipated continuity of sameness, insofar as it assumes a continuity or likeness of bodies to one another, denies disabled bodies the capacity to fit in through placing out of reach all those structures of society predicated upon the assumed continuity of sameness. So thus far, the disinheritance briefly sketched has been grounded in the built environment and the embodied likeness to the built environment. This does not exhaust the ways that a world organized around ableism disinherits disabled people, as we can class cultural goods like philosophy and the processes whereby such goods are produced as one such object, insofar as the organization of the discipline disinherits disabled scholars of their right to participate in the development of human knowledge and meaning making. That is, a world organized by and around ableism doesn't simply disinherit disabled people of the built environment, it disinherits us of the cultural, social, and academic environments through the ways that ableism serves to organize the space of the academy and how knowledge is produced. Now, all of the above points to a world made inaccessible through its organization around ability. All of the preceding discussion also points to the ways that institutions are made inaccessible through their organization around ableism. Here, insofar as I've been speaking of institutions, I'm speaking specifically of educational institutions in the US American context, though the framework supplied, I hope, is flexible enough to apply to a broad class of institutions. Briefly, as institutions are continuous with the cultures, the worlds that produce them, a world organized around ability will produce ableist institutions as an effect not only of the continuity of the institution with the world, but as a result of how that continuity restricts who can and cannot participate in the space of the institution. However, as Ahmed notes, we must take care not to reify the institution as a given. An institution takes shape through the repeated actions and decision of those who make up the institution and thus provide it with its direction. To this end, the inaccessibility of an institution, more than being an effect or affect of the continuity of the institution with an ableist world, is a result of a history of decisions made to keep ableism in place. Put another way, who is allowed into what spaces structures how the institution appears just as much as who is not allowed into what spaces. Moreover, how one finds oneself in the space of the institution is also subject to the logics of likeness described previously. As an example, the concept of fit in hiring and higher education is predicated upon not only academic likeness, a familial connection to the appropriate institutions and scholars through academic pedigree, but upon the very family resemblance indicated above. That is, among the unstated measures of who can fit in a department or an institution, as Ahmed notes, is how the candidate can fit into the shared social space. To this end, Ahmed states, quote, "The very desire for a shared social space can be a desire that restricts to whom an institutional space is open by imagining a social space that is not open to everyone. The likable candidate, the one we would like to hang out with, might be determined as a relation of likeness. In turn, the reference to a leisure space as a measure of recruitability shows how organizational habits are revealed in casual and informal conduct," end quote. Insofar as disability restructures the ways that social spaces are shared, disability becomes the inability to fit into the department, resulting in the disabled candidate being a bad fit for the department and the institution. The limitation on how a social space does or does not enable the candidate to be part of a community, to share a likeness with their colleagues, serves as yet another way that ableism disinherits disabled persons. The functional remedy to what has been described is through the institutional structure of accommodation, which Garland Thompson describes as the most definitive way we become disabled in this historical time and place. By this, one reveals or makes present their disability through appealing to the logic of the right of the disabled person to be extended equal opportunities as full citizens, a logic that requires the force of law and attendant institutional structures to make clear. What is valuable for the present discussion is the affective force of the word accommodation. Accommodation implies the opening up of the institution, a point that Ahmed notes in her discussion of diversity. Moreover, insofar as disabled people have a right to be accommodated by the institution under the law, while the institutional language of accommodation often instructs members of the institution to request accommodations, in most cases, accommodation is experienced by the institution as an imposition upon the institution. It is experienced as a demand. Moreover, this demand must be justified through the institutional processes of accommodation, which required the disabled person to articulate their request, to explain themselves in the appropriate language to enable the smooth circulation of their request through the institution itself. A paper trail must be established, a history presented, and the experience of disability must be legitimated by the institution itself. Only then will the request be granted. A request for accommodation in this way is thus heard as a demand, an attempt by the disabled person to exert their will against the institution, and is responded to by the institution as such through the requirement that the disabled person again explain why they wish to impose their will upon the institution, and why this imposition should be treated as legitimate. The very process of accommodation serves to reveal the inaccessibility of the institution, while simultaneously transforming the disabled person into a problem for the institution or the organization. Here I would like to turn to institutional responses to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So as a result of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, accessibility mechanisms once deemed impossible have not only become possible, but have become commonplace as the virtual conference or meeting supplants the physical conference and social distancing becomes the new normal. While it might be easy to hail the new remote normal and the spread of the virtual conference as a potential victory for accessibility, I disagree. It is my contention that the sudden possibility of impossible accessibility accommodations is the result of the expansion of a world organized around ability in response to a situation that has placed out of reach the world that ability had made inhabitable by some bodies and not others. In short, the accessibility accommodations, like the one that currently enables our conference, have very little to do with enabling access and everything to do with preserving the existing ableist organization of our world. So in the previous discussion, the structure of accommodation served to open an institution that is inaccessible to some bodies and not others. In the wake of COVID-19, institutions that were once selectively accessible have become universally inaccessible. By universally inaccessible, I mean that the conditions of the institution are such that the institution cannot be organized in the same way. Put another way, as institutions are continuous with the worlds from which they emerge, they're also part of the inheritance of the world discussed previously. As COVID-19 has resulted in a partial restructuring of the world, it has also restructured the ways that the world can and cannot be taken up. To be clear, the threat of the virus, which itself I may argue is grounded in the fear of disability, has rendered inaccessible the mechanisms whereby institutions limit who can and cannot participate in the institution by making the inaccessible structure of the institution itself a threat to its participants. Put simply, COVID placed out of reach the world structured by ableism because of the threat it posed to the bodies privileged by ableism. So moreover, the consequences of placing the institution structured by ableism out of reach resulted in the institution inadvertently providing more modes of access to the world organized by ableism. Put another way, accommodations that were once previously placed out of reach or rendered impossible in a world organized around ableism are now commonplace and possible without the imposition of the demand for accommodation. As a result, more people who were previously denied access to the tables around which the institution was organized now have access to those tables, those spaces, and can help direct the organization of the institution in ways they were unable to participate previously. The demand to fit into the physical the demands to fit into physical or institutional spaces have become lessened because of the new normal. However, these new accessibility measures themselves are not accessibility measures. They are an extension of the ways that disabled persons are disinherited by a world organized around ableism. By this, I mean that these accessibility measures are themselves designed to modify a world organized around ableism such that the world can continue to be inherited by those who share a likeness with that world. To provide an example from my lived experience with ADHD, the majority of the accommodations that I would be granted were I a student involved the organization of the physical space of the institution, quiet test-taking areas, additional time in that quiet space to complete examinations, and access to accessibility devices for written examinations. In the current pandemic context, I would not be guaranteed 2 of my 3 accommodations due to the limitations of the ability of the institution to ensure accessibility, as the space of the institution is no longer determined by the physical boundaries of the institution itself. Put another way, the institution could not organize a quiet test-taking area for me. I would have to do so myself. In this way, I would be forced to rely upon the very structures impaired by my disability to accommodate my disability, insofar as I would have to plan and organize my own accommodation. Now, more broadly, if we turn to Ahmed's discussion of institutional diversity as the process of making diversity part of the repeated patterns of action of the institution through the establishment of offices of diversity and other institutional mechanisms, the ways in which COVID-19 accessibility measures are extensions of the world organized around ableism become abundantly clear. If the purposes of offices of accessibility are to institutionalize and enforce the opening up of the institution to disabled people, the provision of access to disabled people and this provision of access is contingent upon the organization of the space of the institution. If the institution itself is rendered inaccessible to everyone, so too do the accommodations that are intended to enable access to the institution through its arms. In short, access to the ability to make the institution more accessible is consequently inaccessible as the organization of the institution itself has shifted. On this view, not only does the organization of the institution in this new normal maintain the disinheritance of disabled people, it extends that disinheritance to the very structures that once provided access to the institution. Now, to be clear, while the preceding discussion has focused on the ways that disabled people are disinherited by a world organized around ableism, it is incomplete in some respects. Crucially, while Ahmed presents whiteness as an orientation and not an object to be reached for, the organization around ableism, specifically through the medicalization of disability, positions ability as an object to be reached for through a variety of technological, scientific, and increasingly eugenic projects that project ability as an object to be granted through technosocial advancements. In this, ability is positioned in line with what Ahmed calls a happy object, or an object that carries with it the promise of happiness over against the unhappiness archive of the history of disability. Histories which challenge ability as a happy object and threaten the happiness to be taken in the able-bodied mind. In many respects, this talk contributes to the unhappiness archive of disability. Additionally, it is not the case that all disabled people are disinherited equally. Ahmed's articulation of a world made white by colonialism, which consequently limits the ways that the world can be taken up and how bodies can be extended through that world, has important implications for the disinheritance of disabled people. To be clear, one of the consequences of a world made white by colonialism is that disability itself is made white, to the extent that the embodiment of a disability by people of color does not possess a likeness or a familiarity to the embodiment of disability by white disabled people, a disabled person of color may not be recognized as disabled. Here I do not simply refer to the diagnostic criteria of disability, but the way that racialized perception structures how we do and do not recognize others as disabled. In considering the preceding, part of the disinheritance of disabled persons of color is not simply from a world organized by ableism, but a world organized by colonialism and a community organized around their embodiment. Insofar as disabled communities themselves may be structured by colonialism, the ways that they recognize and acknowledge how disabled people are disinherited unequally will serve to maintain the image of disability in line with the logics of colonialism. If the image of disability emerges from the activities of disabled white bodies seeking to inherit the world, then the world that will be inherited will be a world of colonial disability, a world that takes the white experience of disability as its starting point. It is a world that I could not and would not want to inherit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. I really appreciated that. We've got a number of questions. I'm so sorry if I'm looking confused, it's because I had to change my screen while I was listening to you. Wonderful. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions. Do please send your questions through. Let us start with one, shall we? So Benjamin Carpenter asks, mirroring Ahmed's concern that we shouldn't reify institutions, isn't there a further concern with reifying any notion of access? What do you think about the difficulties of pursuing a kind of universal accessibility, in brackets, a space that is open to everyone, close brackets, given that different kinds of disability may invite more or less distinct accommodations?
So yes, I agree that we shouldn't reify access and that we should treat access dynamically as a responsiveness to the interaction between disabled bodies and the environment. So I agree that we should not reify access, but my contention here is that insofar as we do not reify access, and insofar as we want to think about design principles as universal, we need to think about access in terms of flexibility. How can the provisions for access and accommodation be structured such that they are flexible enough to be applied within the uniqueness of the particular situation of a disabled body's engagement with an institution? So broadly, I would say yes, we need to, or yes, we should avoid reifying access. And part of this reification is what has happened in the description of COVID-19 modifications or COVID-19 modifications to institutions. These modifications are routinely described as accessibility modifications, which in turn reifies and recenters the understanding of access around non-disabled bodies. So yeah, I generally agree that we should avoid reifying access, and one way to do that is to treat access as a dynamic and flexible concept. Even among folks with diagnostically identical disabilities, accommodations do not function in the same way. The ways that my sister's ADHD is accommodated are not the ways that mine is accommodated. They do not work for both of us equally. And so we need to bear in mind the dynamism of body environment interactions.
Great, thank you very much. I think that's really interesting because people always forget that there's disability is one of the kind of most heterogeneous spaces. And so even universal design for learning actually isn't, we should do something for everybody. We should just ensure that, you know, universal access is a possibility. Okay. Next question from Rhea Williams. Rhea Williams asks, thank you so much, Rhea. I'm thinking a lot about how the rapid shift to online conference delivery has led able-bodied organizers to haphazardly pick whatever platform seems most convenient without any thought to access. They are so busy patting themselves on the back for their ingenuity under pressure that any requests for access, CART, so speech to text transcription, for example, are met with fresh hostility. Disabled people so used to begging for crumbs. So as you say, we become disinherited from our own accommodations as they are taken up by the institution for its own survival. What practices of resistance do you notice happening right now? How are disabled people forging their own collective inheritances? And is this all we have at this point, each other? How can we transform the world beyond our chosen communities? This might have been a good question for later, but maybe we can try and field this one now if you're happy to.
Sure. So I'm gonna appeal to John Dewey, right? So Dewey says of democracy, in order to instantiate a true democracy, the instantiation of a true democracy would require the fundamental restructuring of our social, cultural, and moral organizations, right? So I tend to take accessibility in the same way. If you wanted a truly accessible institution, you'd have to so thoroughly restructure the institution in ways that make folks who are at home in the institution profoundly uncomfortable. Now, to respond to the question more directly, yes. Insofar as I've said that the accommodations the accommodations that have emerged in response to COVID-19 are not really accommodations, they're merely the expansion of the previous world in response to an existential threat. Generally, I would agree, all we have is one another. And one of the easiest ways to, or one of the strategies of resistance that I see emerging consistently is the say nonstop demonstration of the hypocrisy of saying the virtual conference or the remote learning situation was an impossibility to deploy at scale prior to this existential threat. Yeah. That is shaming the institutions into recognizing the ways that they traffic and trade in hypocrisy, not merely materially, but conceptually, right? If an institution claims in its mission statement that it is committed to providing access to all, and yet it is suddenly possible to do so when a majority is now under threat, that puts lie to the claim of access. So yes, all we have is one another. And as insofar as we think about effective strategies of resistance, shaming institutions into doing what they were supposed to do, I think is one of the more effective strategies, aside from simply tearing the things down.
Bound to be a fine thing. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay. So another question here, Anna Rienke Fuel, apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, asks, with regard to architectural structures as both sense-giving and signifying, I have a question on intersectionality in a case regarding the university building of my workplace. We're advocating for the main entrance to be made accessible rather than many people with disabilities only having the option to enter through the back door. I'm grinning because I'm disabled and I use a mobility scooter. So a lot of this is very kind of like familiar to me, like back door entrance. Yeah, that's totally how we get in the room. At the same time, cleaning and security staff generally also enter the building through this back door. There is no formal room against them. Is claiming access through the main entrance the best way to go, or should we somehow claim high status of back door entrance? I think this ends up being quite a specific question, but it ends with the question of how would you reflect on this case? So this kind of very sort of stereotypical manifestation of, and it's a really good example actually of the way in which, what wheelchair user or mobility aid access, to be quite precise, looks like to most universities and other buildings is that you go in through the staff, the janitor entrance, and there's nothing, you end up with quite good relationships with cleaners and janitors because those are the people who show your entrances and your lifts, typically, in my own kind of history. But is that, I guess, a case that would for you speak to the kind of issues that you were raising in this talk?
Yes and no. So my reflection on this would be, so one, I think we're asking the wrong question. It's not, is claiming access through the main entrance the best way to go, or should we elevate the backdoor entrance? It's, why is the entrance structured in this way in the first place, right? So it's the question of, do we build more doors on the forum so that more people could get in, or do we simply restructure the forum so that this is not a question we're even asking? But this is a very radical response to the question, right? To reframe the notion of entrances and what they look like. Now, a more practical response, I would say, is both and, right? So claim access through the main entrance to say, claim access to the main entrance to say, re-emphasize the participation of disabled persons in the academic community, while at the same time may point out very loudly the implicit marginalization of the back entrance, right? So insofar as some people are relegated to the back entrance, the institution is making a statement about how and where one can enter the institution. So that is to say both and, right? So elevate the backdoor entrance and claim access to the main entrance, but also challenge the notion of why these entrances are privileged in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic, thank you so much. Okay, let's find another question. Before we go, I'm going to take chest privilege actually. So there's a thought there that seems to track what you're saying about the accommodationist model, right? There seems to be a parallel between the doors. The door seems like quite a nice metaphor for this idea, like, no, we really want you, but as long as you come in through this kind of retrofitted way, and then if we're thinking about our kind of responses to it, then we really do have this like, okay, well, are we going to amend the existing infrastructure, which is the accommodationist model, right? Or are we going to build a new infrastructure that already anticipates certain kinds of bodily difference, or, the kind of range of experiential difference as part of who our community is that we start with? Okay, great. So we've had some more questions in. Unless you want to comment on that?
No.
Cool, right. So, This is an anonymous question. Melinda Hall and Camille Robertson have asked questions on COVID-19. In general, can you share any more regarding the fear of COVID as a manifestation of ableism? And specifically, do you have any advice to use to push back institutionally as faculty, perhaps with regard to unmaking disability, such as Julie maybe discussed this morning in university accessibility centers?
Okay. So that's a long answer. So first, the majority. So if you read the reporting on the effects of COVID-19 beyond death, so taking death off the table here, it's usually articulated as impairment, right? So people who survive COVID-19 have memory issues, have fatigue issues, have difficulty breathing, have other kinds of embodied differences that make inheriting the world as traditionally organized far more difficult, right? So insofar as we talk about COVID-19 and surviving COVID-19 as a kind of fear of disability, we can talk about COVID-19, the fear of COVID-19, as a fear of becoming disabled, right? Of losing the primary mode in which we inherit the world. So attendant with that, to answer the second part of the question, how do we push back as faculty? One, I mean, we need to take seriously any student report about other faculty not accepting or granting accommodations, even when documentation is presented, as massively problematic. We need to treat this not as single one-off instances as bad actors, but as the tip of the iceberg with regards to a broader kind of problem. The other thing is we can take up the hypocrisy that I pointed out earlier as a recognition that it's not impossible to provide disabled persons with accommodations they ask. It's just the result of institutional unwillingness, right? So as faculty, we can repeat over and over and over that it is now possible to do things remotely. We simply weren't unwilling to do so previously, and we can insist on institutions figuring out ways to, say, unmake disability and unmake offices of disability such that they're not totally reliant upon the organization of a pre-COVID world to provide their accommodations, right? So I have an ever-growing archive of the ways that institutional accommodations have failed students in K through 12 up through higher education, and most of it, in my view, is a result of the ways that the accommodations as supplied by the institution are grounded in a world that sustained and maintained the institution, and it's a world that no longer exists for the foreseeable future. So what faculty can do is to encourage or demand that the institution take a serious look at the ways that accommodations are provided within this new normal, within this new reality, right? And to be quite honest, shame them, right?
Yeah. That sounds plausible. Everybody start shaming your institutions if you're so inclined for their inconsistency on this. Okay, so we have one. How are we doing for time? Okay, I think we're going to take maybe, do you want one more question on COVID, or would you like to move on to something else?
I could, if you're talking about Dee Holloway's question, I can do that and something else.
Cool. Okay, then. So I will take Dee Holloway's question, which is this. So taking up your excellent point about how COVID has caused institutions to apparently reorient themselves, but around a continued ableism, how helpful do you think it might be to interrogate how institutional calls for the necessity of maintaining quote unquote core activity have led to frictionless adjustments? That is, does the removal of friction in the face of quote unquote maintaining a core, end quote, show that disabled people are fundamentally not part of how an institution imagines its core?
The reason why I took this question is because I can give a simple answer, yes, right? If it's frictionless to say, and I really want to put frictionless in scare quotes because Anybody who's had to convert a syllabus to a remote fashion on the drop of a hat knows the large amount of friction that emerges in doing so. But putting that aside, that the speed at which our institutions have shifted to maintain core activities in a remote kind of situation indicates the ways that disabled people and disability itself is fundamentally not a part of how an institution imagines itself, right?
Yeah.
If it was this easy, why didn't you do it before?
Yeah, well, because of everything that you identify. And just on the frictionless adjustments thing, I think it's really important to mention, because the question is about disabled people, not just about disabled students. Actually, disabled staff, disabled academics, for all kinds of reasons, you know, some of whom are high risk for COVID, some of whom are not, some of whom are energy impaired, all the rest of it. You know, that whole raft of, I mean, I'm not teaching, but it seems like no one's taken a break the whole summer, and so we've got interesting questions coming in, you know, in the next 12 months about teacher burnout. Anyway, fantastic. All right. So maybe one last question. Balan Kenta has asked, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. In terms of disinheritance being unequally inherited through the history of colonialism and racism, you mentioned that disabled people of color may often be seen as non-disabled or being unlike disabled white bodies in terms of accommodation and access. How would we also bring this into conversation with, for instance, what Nirmala Iraveles says about how race, blackness specifically, is constructed from the outset as a category of disability, both social and quite literally as impairment, through the violence of slavery, colonialism, and now racialized capitalism?
So this is a good one, and I can draw on my kind of lived experience here, right? So insofar as our racial perceptions affect how we perceive the disabilities of others, in my lived experience as someone who has grown up with ADHD, my disability wasn't necessarily, or the symptoms of my disability in a broader medical sense weren't necessarily seen as a product of my ADHD, but a product of me being an oppositional Black child in a predominantly white setting, right? So insofar as my distractibility, my impulsiveness, and so on were viewed as disruptive, the disruption they weren't located as indications of disability, except insofar as Blackness is constructed as a kind of disability. So in this way, my ADHD was not really ADHD, it was just me being Black, right? And so it took particular kinds of insistence to receive the appropriate accommodations. And insofar as Blackness has been historically constructed as a category of disability, we can think about how the ways in which colonialism organizes systems of education and institutions broadly serves to maintain the structure, right? So insofar as say educational, or insofar as Black students with disabilities are more likely to be subject to disciplinary action rather than to accommodation action, we can see how the conflation of Blackness and the racial logics of disciplining Blackness align with or obscure the possibility of a disabled Black person. That is, it's not simply that a Black person has a disability. It's not simply that a Black person has a mental health issue. It's that the Black person is acting out of their Blackness, and there is no need to intervene intervene with the accommodation structures that are necessary. Moreover, there's also the sense that the ways that the accommodation structures are currently patterned are not responsive to the cultural inheritances of Black disabled people, right?
That's a really good answer. I think we might just kind of end. Do you want to take one more question?
I don't know if I
don't think we've got 1 minute perhaps, or we could stay on this thought. There is a question, I guess it's a follow-up to this question about the sort of intersection between disability and blackness, which is another one, and I'm smiling because I think this does come out a lot in these sorts of spaces. What can individuals do to break these disempowering practices? So someone else who's interested in what you personally would say.
So what can we do to break the existing hiring practices?
Disempowering practices of the social and cultural norms and hypocrisy with respect to disability and kind of race together, I think. Sorry, big one to end on there, Johnathan.
Pushback in all of the ways that are necessary. And I think COVID-19 provides us with effective ammunition to do so. When someone says that it is impossible to accommodate a disabled person in a particular way, we can simply say that, well, you have accommodated your entire population in this way. What prevents you from doing it again, right? So I'll push back and keep pushing back, but recognize the particularity of individual ways that disability transacts with the environment. So it's not simply pushing back, it's pushing back in specific intentional ways.
And then presumably on this way in which we can kind of understand, thanks to your fantastic paper, the way in which the whole of the kind of instituting infrastructure is about instituting a kind of, you know, pushing and effectively an othering of disabled bodies and disabled, you know, needs as opposed to norms. Fantastic. Yes. I think very sadly we've run out of time, even though there's so much really important and interesting material to talk about here. So I think if we can all, you know, do our virtual clapping, I guess, to say thank you very much. Oh, actual clapping, hooray. Thank you so much, Christine Overall, Johnathan, well, wonderful. We can show our appreciation for Johnathan Flowers' fantastic talk.
So thank you so much, Johnathan. Thank you, Zara. A fantastic session.